The elevator doors slid open at precisely 6:47 a.m., revealing 3 federal agents in navy windbreakers standing in the marble lobby. I watched from across the street, my breath fogging in the cold morning air, as the youngest agent clutched a manila folder thick with documents. The woman in charge checked her watch, then glanced toward the revolving glass doors where I'd be entering any moment. I took a breath, adjusted my briefcase, and started walking toward the building I'd called home for 15 years. Upstairs on the 14th floor, the lights in the executive suite were already blazing. Inside the corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, Ashton Blackwell sat behind a desk that still smelled of new leather. He'd owned the building for exactly 16 hours. The sale had finalized yesterday at 4 p.m., and he'd immediately moved into what he kept calling his rightful place. He had no idea that his empire was about to crumble before his first official day even began. Welcome to the Payback Office channel, where stories of professional justice, workplace karma, and the sweet satisfaction of watching arrogance meet its match come to life. If you're drawn to tales where integrity wins and bullies get their comeuppance, you've found your home. Consider subscribing and helping us reach 8,000 subscribers. Join a community that believes professionalism and accountability should never go out of style. My name is Calla Winterborn, and this is the story of how the man who called me obsolete ended up in federal custody before his first cup of coffee. My 15-year journey from junior analyst to chief operating officer of Meridian Heights Commercial Properties should have been the beginning of my golden years in the industry. Instead, it became a masterclass in patience, documentation, and the long game of professional revenge. I came from a middle-class family in Michigan where my parents ran a small accounting firm, nothing flashy, just honest work. They taught me that numbers never lie, and that the truth always has a way of surfacing if you're willing to wait for it. Now back to that lobby. The revolving door spun, and I stepped through, my charcoal gray suit pressed, my dark hair pulled back in a simple twist. I carried a single briefcase and wore the kind of calm expression that comes from knowing something everyone else doesn't. The lead federal agent stepped forward. "Miss Winterborn." That would be me. I kept my voice steady, almost pleasant. "Special Agent Monica Torres, FBI White Collar Crime Division. We spoke on the phone last night. Is Mr. Blackwell upstairs?" "He is, 14th floor, corner office. He's been there since 5 this morning, according to the building access logs." I set my briefcase down and pulled out my phone, tapping the screen twice. "I've just sent you the updated access codes for the executive suite. He changed them at 5:23 a.m., probably thinking that would keep people out. It won't." Agent Torres allowed herself a slight smile. "You've been very thorough, Miss Winterborn." 15 years of thoroughness, Agent Torres. When you build something from the ground up, you remember every detail, every system, every password, every skeleton in every closet. The other 2 agents moved toward the elevator bank. I watched them go, then turned back to Agent Torres. "What happens now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Now we execute a federal search warrant. Now we seize records. Now we arrest Ashton Blackwell on 17 counts of securities fraud, money laundering, and wire fraud." Torres paused. "Thanks to the evidence you've been compiling for the past 4 months." I nodded slowly. "He called me obsolete yesterday, in front of my entire team. 23 people I'd hired, trained, and worked alongside for years. He stood there with his Harvard MBA and his trust fund confidence and told them all that I represented old thinking and that the company needed disruptive innovation." "How did that feel?" Torres asked. "Like watching someone juggle chainsaws while standing on a trapdoor, impressive right up until gravity gets involved." I picked up my briefcase. I smiled because I knew what was coming. I've known since the day his name first appeared in connection with the acquisition. "You knew he was dirty." "I knew he was sloppy. There's a difference. Dirty is a moral judgment. Sloppy is a professional assessment, and Ashton Blackwell is the sloppiest white-collar criminal I've ever seen." 4 months earlier, the conference room on the 14th floor had been packed with employees, all buzzing with nervous energy. I'd stood at the front of the room, watching my team settle into their seats. These were people I'd recruited from dozens of companies. Some I'd known for a decade. Others were fresh out of graduate programs, hungry and talented. Theodore Gaines, the previous owner and CEO, had stood beside me. At 72, Theodore was ready to retire. He'd built the company over 30 years, and now he wanted to spend time with his grandchildren, maybe do some traveling. He'd promised me that he'd find the right buyer, someone who would preserve the company culture, someone who would value the team. I know there's been a lot of speculation, Theodore had begun, his voice carrying that grandfatherly warmth that had always put people at ease. So I wanted to address it directly. Yes, I'm selling the company. And yes, I've found a buyer. The room had gone silent. His name is Ashton Blackwell. He's young, brilliant, and he comes with impeccable credentials. Harvard Business School, successful ventures in commercial real estate, and a vision for growth that impressed me greatly. I'd kept my expression neutral, but internally, alarms were already sounding. I'd done my homework the moment Theodore mentioned Ashton's name as a potential buyer. What I'd found had concerned me deeply. Ashton Blackwell was 32 years old. He'd inherited a significant trust fund at 25 and had immediately begun acquiring properties and companies. On paper, everything looked legitimate. But when I dug deeper, and I always dug deeper, patterns emerged. Companies he acquired often showed dramatic financial improvements in the first 6 months, then quietly filed for bankruptcy or were sold off in pieces 18 to 24 months later. Properties were bought, renovated with suspiciously cheap labor and materials, then flipped at enormous profits to offshore investment groups with murky ownership structures. Nothing definitively illegal, but everything circumstantially suspicious. I'd brought my concerns to Theodore, who dismissed them. "You're being paranoid, Calla," he'd said over lunch one afternoon. "I've vetted him thoroughly, his references check out, his financials are solid, I think you're just worried about change." "I'm worried about patterns," I'd replied. "And the pattern here is someone who knows how to make money disappear and reappear in convenient places." Theodore had patted my hand in that condescending way that older men sometimes do when they think women are being overly emotional. "Trust me on this. Ashton is the right choice." That conversation had been 8 weeks before the sale finalized. 8 weeks that I'd used to prepare for the inevitable. Back in that conference room, Theodore had continued his announcement. "Ashton will be taking over as CEO effective immediately upon closing. I'm confident he'll lead this company to new heights. Calla will remain as COO, providing continuity and institutional knowledge during the transition." The applause had been polite but uncertain. Change is always uncomfortable, especially when it comes from the top. After the meeting, I'd returned to my office and opened a new folder on my encrypted personal drive. I labeled it Contingency Protocol. Inside, I began documenting everything. Every email from Ashton during the transition period, every phone call with detailed notes, every request, every directive, every questionable decision. I cross-referenced his instructions with company policy, with industry regulations, with federal guidelines. And I waited. Ashton's first official act, even before the sale closed, had been to request complete access to the company's financial systems. Not unusual for an incoming owner, but the way he'd phrased it had been telling. "I need back-end access to all accounts," he'd written in an email, "including the subsidiary holdings and the offshore consulting agreements, full administrative privileges, unrestricted." I'd provided the access as requested, but I'd also created a mirror log that documented every action taken under those credentials. Every file accessed, every record modified, every transaction initiated. It was an IT trick I'd learned years ago from a security consultant. Always have a shadow system. Always have a second set of eyes. Within the first week after taking ownership, Ashton had accessed files that had no legitimate business reason for an owner to review. Payroll records for individual employees going back 5 years. Vendor contracts that had been completed and archived. Personal information about board members and major clients. He was looking for something, or he was building leverage. Either way, it was inappropriate. The next red flag came during Ashton's second week. He'd called me into his office, the office that had been Theodore's, which Ashton had already redecorated with expensive modern furniture and abstract art that probably cost more than most employees made in a year. "I've been reviewing our operational costs," Ashton had said, not bothering with pleasantries. He gestured to a spreadsheet on his monitor. "We're spending too much on compliance and auditing. I want to cut those departments by 60%. I'd remained standing, my hands folded in front of me. 60% would put us below the minimum staffing requirements for a company of our size and scope. We'd be in violation of Sarbanes-Oxley provisions." "Those provisions are suggestions, not requirements," Ashton had replied dismissively. "They're federal law, actually." He'd looked at me with barely concealed irritation. "Calla, I appreciate your institutional perspective, but I didn't buy this company to maintain the status quo. We need to be leaner, more aggressive. Compliance is a cost center, not a profit center." "Compliance is what keeps us out of federal prison," I'd said evenly. "But if you'd like to reduce those costs, I can prepare a detailed analysis of where we might find efficiencies without compromising our legal obligations." Ashton had waved his hand. "Just cut the staff. I don't need an analysis." "I'll need that directive in writing, please." His eyes had narrowed. "Excuse me." "Any significant restructuring needs to be documented for board review and regulatory filing. It's standard procedure. I'll draft a memo outlining your request, and if you'll sign off on it, I'll begin the process." He'd stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to decide if I was being insubordinate or just thorough. Finally, he'd nodded. "Fine, send me the memo." I'd sent it within the hour. He'd never signed it. Instead, the topic of compliance cuts had quietly disappeared. That became the pattern. Ashton would make an aggressive, often legally questionable demand. I'd request it in writing. The demand would evaporate. But Ashton was learning. He was getting smarter about covering his tracks. 3 weeks into his ownership, he'd started bringing in outside consultants. They weren't from reputable firms. Their credentials were vague. Their recommendations were always the same: move money, restructure holdings, create new subsidiary entities in business-friendly jurisdictions. I'd sat in those meetings, taking meticulous notes. I'd smiled and nodded and asked clarifying questions that seemed innocent, but were actually designed to get people to elaborate on plans that were increasingly suspicious. "So when you say we should create a Cayman Islands subsidiary to handle our international consulting fees," I'd asked one consultant, a slick young man named Brett Hutchinson, "are you suggesting we route actual consulting revenue through that entity, or are we talking about a management fee structure?" Brett had blinked, clearly not expecting detailed questions. Management fees, definitely management fees. And those fees would be paid by our domestic entity to the Cayman entity for what services exactly? Strategic oversight. Could you elaborate on what strategic oversight would entail? I want to make sure our documentation is precise for audit purposes. Brett had glanced at Ashton, who jumped in. "We'll work out the details later, Calla. Let's not get bogged down in minutiae right now." But I'd already gotten what I needed. I'd gotten them to say the quiet part out loud. I'd gotten them to describe what was essentially a shell company designed to hide taxable income. And I'd recorded it all. Not audio recordings, that would be illegal without consent in our state. But detailed, time-stamped notes sent to my personal encrypted email immediately after each meeting, creating a paper trail that would be admissible in court if it ever came to that. By week 6, Ashton had started excluding me from certain meetings. I'd expected that. He was getting frustrated with my questions, my requests for documentation, my insistence on following proper procedures. But excluding me was a mistake on his part because the people still in those meetings were loyal to me. I'd hired most of them. I'd mentored them. And when they saw things that concerned them, they came to me privately. Justin Liu, the senior financial analyst, had knocked on my office door late one Thursday evening. "You got a minute?" he'd asked, looking nervous. "Always close the door." Justin had sat down, his laptop bag clutched in front of him like a shield. Something weird is happening with the Q3 reports. Weird how? Blackwell had me revise the revenue recognition on the Hollister project. We completed that project in June, right? So revenue should be recognized in Q2. Correct. He wants it moved to Q3. He said something about aligning with new accounting methods, but that doesn't make sense. We can't just arbitrarily shift revenue between quarters. I'd leaned back in my chair. Did he put this request in writing? Email, I can forward it to you. Do that, but send it to my personal email, not my work account. Justin's eyebrows had risen. Is something going on that I should know about? Let's just say I'm being careful. And you should be too. If Ashton asks you to do anything else that seems unusual, document it and let me know. Justin had nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. That's why you kept asking me to send you those emails. You were building a case. I was protecting you, all of you. If any of you had participated in what Ashton was doing, you could have faced charges. I needed to make sure there was a clear record of who knew what and when. The revenue manipulation was the first concrete evidence of fraud. Moving revenue between quarters to create the illusion of growth was a classic technique. It made the current quarter look better to potential investors or lenders, creating artificial momentum. But it was also illegal. It was securities fraud, plain and simple. I'd started reaching out to contacts, former colleagues in the industry, people who'd worked with Ashton at previous companies, and the stories that came back were remarkably consistent. A former CFO from a property management company Ashton had acquired told me he came in promising innovation and growth. 6 months later, he'd restructured everything, moved assets around, took out massive loans against the company's holdings, then sold the whole thing to some investment group in Luxembourg. We all lost our jobs. The company filed for bankruptcy 8 months after he sold it. A compliance officer from another firm said, "We kept finding irregularities, but whenever we tried to investigate, we'd get shut down." Ashton had a way of making you feel like you were the problem, like you were too rigid, too old school. Then he fired the entire compliance department and brought in some boutique firm that rubber-stamped everything he wanted. The pattern was clear. Ashton would acquire a company, strip out the oversight, manipulate the financials to show growth, borrow heavily against the inflated value, then sell before the house of cards collapsed. He'd walk away wealthy, while employees and creditors were left with nothing. And he was trying to do the same thing here. I'd realized I needed help. This was beyond my expertise. I needed law enforcement, but I also needed to build an airtight case before approaching them. I'd spent my weekends at the office, going through years of financial records, cross-referencing them with bank statements, loan documents, and regulatory filings. I'd created spreadsheets that mapped money flows through subsidiary companies. I'd documented shell corporations, offshore accounts, and suspicious transactions. And I'd found the smoking gun. Ashton had created 3 subsidiary companies shortly after acquiring the firm. On paper, they were consulting entities that provided strategic services. In reality, they did nothing. They had no employees, no office space, no actual business activities. But they were receiving payments. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in consulting fees from the main company. Those fees were being reported as business expenses, reducing the company's taxable income. The money would sit in the subsidiaries' accounts for a few weeks, then get transferred to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. From there, the trail got murky, but I'd found enough to show the pattern. This wasn't just aggressive accounting. This was money laundering. This was fraud on a federal level. I'd contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division through a former colleague whose brother was an agent. I'd arranged a meeting, brought my documentation, and spent 4 hours walking them through what I'd found. Agent Monica Torres had been assigned to the case. She'd listened carefully, asked pointed questions, and reviewed the evidence with the kind of attention to detail that told me this was going to be taken seriously. "This is substantial," Torres had said, "but we need more. We need to catch him in the act, not just show what he's done. Can you help us with that?" "What do you need?" Access, information, real-time awareness of what he's planning. Can you stay in your position and keep feeding us intelligence? I'd considered it. It would mean walking a tightrope. It would mean maintaining my professional composure while watching Ashton continue to damage the company I'd helped build. But it would also mean bringing him to justice. It would mean protecting the employees who trusted me. It would mean ensuring that what happened to those other companies wouldn't happen here. I can do that, I'd said. For the next 6 weeks, I'd been the FBI's eyes and ears inside the company. I'd documented every suspicious transaction, every questionable meeting, every piece of evidence that built the case against Ashton. I'd worn a wire to meetings. I'd provided copies of emails and financial documents. I'd identified which banks Ashton was working with, which consultants were helping him structure the fraud, which overseas entities were receiving the money. And through it all, I'd maintained my professional demeanor. I'd shown up every day, done my job, managed my team, and smiled through Ashton's increasingly obvious contempt for me. He'd started making comments in meetings. Kala here represents the old guard, he'd say with a dismissive wave. She's very good at maintaining systems, but we need people who can break systems, who can think outside the box. I'd nod and smile. Someone has to make sure the box is still there when we need it. My team had noticed the tension. Some had approached me privately to offer support. He's a jerk, one of my senior managers had said. Everyone can see it. We've got your back. I appreciate that, I'd replied. Just keep doing your jobs, doing them well, and documenting everything. That's the best thing you can do right now. Yesterday had been the culmination of months of building pressure. Ashton had called an all-staff meeting. Everyone from the company had crowded into the main conference room, standing room only. He'd stood at the front, looking every inch the young tech bro CEO, dressed in expensive casual, where that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I want to talk about the future, he'd begun. This company has been successful, but success in the past doesn't guarantee success in the future. We need to evolve. We need to disrupt ourselves before someone else disrupts us. Standard business school rhetoric. Empty phrases that sounded profound but meant nothing. That's why I'm making some changes to the leadership structure, he'd continued. Effective immediately, we're going to have a flatter organization. We're going to empower people to make decisions, to take risks, to fail fast and learn faster. I'd stood at the side of the room, my expression carefully neutral. I'd known what was coming. Agent Torres had warned me the day before. He's planning to fire you, Torres had said over the phone. One of his consultants let it slip in a conversation we intercepted. He thinks you're the main obstacle to his plans. He's right, I'd replied. I am. Can you handle being fired in front of everyone? I know that's going to be humiliating. I've handled worse, and besides, it'll be the last mistake he makes. Now, standing in that conference room, I'd watched Ashton's performance with the detached interest of someone watching a play they'd already read. Part of this restructuring, Ashton had said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, means making difficult decisions about roles and responsibilities. Some positions that made sense in the old model don't make sense going forward. He'd turned to look directly at me. Kala Winterbourne has been with this company for 15 years. She's been a dedicated employee, and I want to acknowledge her service. But the role of COO, as it's currently structured, represents old thinking. It represents a hierarchical, process-heavy approach that doesn't fit our new vision. The room had gone very quiet. People had exchanged glances, unsure of what was happening. So effective immediately, we're eliminating the COO position. Kala, I want to thank you for your years of service, but we're going to be moving in a different direction. He'd said it so casually, as if he were announcing a change in the lunch menu. As if he hadn't just fired someone in front of their entire professional community. I'd let the moment hang there for a beat, then I'd smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a fake smile, a genuine, satisfied smile. I appreciate your honesty, Ashton, I'd said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. I wish you the very best with your new vision. I'd picked up my bag, given a small wave to my team, and walked out. Behind me, I'd heard the murmurs starting. Confusion, outrage, discomfort. But I'd kept walking, out of the conference room, down the hall, into my office where I'd collected a few personal items, and then to the elevator. The whole time, I'd been smiling. Because I knew what was coming. I'd gone home, poured myself a glass of wine, and called Agent Tours. "It's done," I'd said. "He fired me just like you predicted." "Perfect. We execute the warrant tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. We'll have him in custody before his first meeting of the day." "I want to be there." "You sure you don't have to be?" "I'm sure I want to see his face." Which brought everything full circle to this morning, standing in the lobby at dawn, watching federal agents disappear into the elevator. I'd turned to Agent Tours. "How long until you bring him down?" "We're serving the warrant now. We'll need a few hours to secure the scene and begin collecting evidence. He'll be in custody by noon, arraigned this afternoon." "And the employees, my team?" "They'll be interviewed as witnesses, but unless we find evidence of their involvement, they're in the clear. From everything you've told us and everything we found, Ashton kept the illegal activities compartmentalized. Your people should be fine." I'd nodded, relief washing over me. That had been my biggest concern, that good people would be caught up in Ashton's schemes. "What happens to the company?" Tours had shrugged. "That's above my pay grade. Probably goes into some kind of receivership while the courts sort it out. Could be sold, could be restructured. But it'll be clean, whatever happens." "And me?" "You're a witness. A cooperating witness who provided crucial evidence. You'll probably have to testify at trial, but you're not in any legal jeopardy." "That's not what I meant. I meant, what do I do now? I just lost my job, my career, everything I built." Agent Tours had given me a long look. "Miss Winterbourne, you didn't lose anything. You chose integrity over comfort. You chose to do the right thing even when it cost you something. That's not losing. That's winning in the only way that matters." I'd felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "Besides," Tours had continued with a slight smile, "when this story goes public, and it will, you're going to be the COO who took down a fraudster. You're going to have job offers from every company that values ethical leadership. Trust me, you're going to land on your feet." From upstairs, there had been the faint sound of raised voices. I'd glanced toward the elevator bank. "That'll be Ashton realizing his morning isn't going as planned," Tours had said dryly. "Come on, let's go up. You've earned the right to watch this." We'd taken the elevator to the 14th floor. The doors had opened onto chaos. Federal agents were everywhere, carrying boxes of documents, imaging hard drives, photographing office spaces. Employees were being escorted to conference rooms for interviews. And in the center of it all, Ashton Blackwell stood in handcuffs, his face red with fury. "This is insane," he'd been shouting at one of the agents. "I'm a legitimate businessman. I've done nothing wrong. This is harassment." He'd spotted me stepping off the elevator, and his expression had shifted from anger to pure hatred. "You," he'd hissed, "you did this, you bitter Obsolete." "Mr. Blackwell," Agent Tours had interrupted firmly, "I'd advise you to stop talking. Anything you say can and will be used against you." "I know my rights, and I know this is all her fault," he'd glared at me. "You couldn't handle being replaced, could you? Couldn't handle someone younger and smarter taking over your little kingdom." I'd walked slowly toward him, my hands in my pockets, completely calm. "Ashton," I'd said quietly, "I didn't do this to you. You did this to yourself. I just documented it." "You sabotaged me." "No, I protected the company you were trying to destroy. I protected the employees you were willing to sacrifice for your profit. I did my job." "Your job was to follow my orders." "My job was to ensure this company operated legally and ethically. Those two things turned out to be incompatible with your vision." One of the agents had started to lead Ashton toward the elevator. He'd resisted, still trying to get the last word. "You're done in this industry. No one will hire you after this. You'll be known as a snitch, a traitor." I'd smiled that same calm smile. "I'll be known as someone who chose principle over profit. I can live with that." As Ashton had been led away, still shouting threats and accusations, Justin Liu had appeared from one of the conference rooms. He'd looked shaken but relieved. Calla, what's happening? The company is being investigated for financial fraud, but you and the rest of the team are going to be fine. Just answer the agent's questions honestly, tell them everything you know, and you'll be okay. Did you know this was coming? I suspected problems. I documented what I found. I reported it to the proper authorities. That's all I can say right now. Justin had nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. That's why you kept asking me to send you those emails. You were building a case. I was protecting you, all of you. If any of you had participated in what Ashton was doing, you could have faced charges. I needed to make sure there was a clear record of who knew what and when. Other employees had started emerging from their interviews, gathering in small clusters in the hallway. When they'd seen me, several had come over. Is it true he fired you yesterday? One of them had asked. Yes. That's so messed up, after everything you've done for this company. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't rewarded immediately, I'd said, but it's still worth doing. By early afternoon, the initial chaos had settled into organized investigation. Agent Tours had found me in what used to be my office, looking out the window at the city below. How are you holding up? Tours had asked. Honestly, I'm exhausted, and relieved and a little sad. Sad? I built something here. Not just a career, but a team, a culture, a way of doing business that I believed in. And in 1 quarter, Ashton nearly destroyed it all. But he didn't, because you stopped him. I'd turned from the window. What happens now with the case? We've got him on 17 counts currently. Could be more as we dig deeper. With the evidence you provided and what we're finding in these offices, this is going to be a very strong case. My guess is his lawyers will push for a plea deal. And if he doesn't take a deal, then it goes to trial and you testify. You walk a jury through everything you found, everything you documented. You explain how he systematically defrauded investors, employees, and creditors. I can do that. I know you can. You're probably the most prepared witness I've ever worked with. Tours had paused. For what it's worth, I think what you did took tremendous courage. A lot of people in your position would have just walked away, found another job, let someone else deal with the mess. I couldn't do that. This was my company as much as anyone's. These were my people. I couldn't just abandon them to a predator. Agent Tours had extended her hand. The Bureau appreciates your cooperation. If you ever need a reference, give them my name. We'd shaken hands, and Tours had left to oversee the rest of the operation. I'd spent the rest of the day helping facilitate the investigation, providing context and information that only someone with my institutional knowledge could offer. By the time evening rolled around and the agents finally started packing up, I was one of the last people still in the building. I'd walked through the offices one last time, turning off lights, straightening chairs. Habits from 15 years of treating this place as my second home. In the lobby, the security guard, a man named Malcolm who'd worked there almost as long as I had given me a sympathetic look. Rough day, Miss Winterbourne. That's one way to put it, Malcolm. For what it's worth, everyone knows you always did right by this company. Whatever happened today, I'm sure you had good reasons. Thank you, that means a lot. I'd walked out into the evening air, the sun setting behind the downtown buildings, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. My phone had buzzed, a text from Theodore Gaines, the former owner. Just heard about Ashton. Are you okay? Can we talk? I'd smiled. Oh, we were definitely going to talk. Theodore owed me an apology for dismissing my concerns, and I intended to collect it. But that could wait until tomorrow. For now, I just walked. No destination in mind, just putting one foot in front of the other, processing everything that had happened. My phone had buzzed again. This time, it was an email from a headhunter I'd worked with years ago. Calla, heard through the grapevine something big went down at your company. If you're looking for new opportunities, I've got 3 firms that would kill to talk to you. Call me. I'd laughed out loud. Agent Tours had been right. Word was already spreading. Over the next few weeks, the story had indeed gone public. Business journalists had picked up on the FBI investigation, on the dramatic arrest, on the allegations of fraud and money laundering. And they'd picked up on my role. Whistleblower COO brings down fraudster CEO, one headline had read. 15-year veteran chooses ethics over employment, read another. The coverage had been overwhelmingly positive. Op-eds about the importance of corporate accountability. Think pieces about the courage required to stand up to corrupt leadership. Interviews with business ethics professors using me as a case study in doing the right thing. My LinkedIn inbox had exploded with messages, job offers, speaking invitations, requests for interviews. Theodore had finally called, contrite and apologetic. I should have listened to you, he'd said. I was blinded by Ashton's credentials and his promises of growth. I didn't do my due diligence. No, you didn't, I'd agreed. And it almost cost a lot of good people their careers. Is there anything I can do to make this right? You can be a reference for me. You can tell people that in all the years we worked together, I never once compromised on integrity. That I was right about Ashton even when you didn't want to hear it. I can do that, I will do that. And Calla, I'm sorry, truly. I'd accepted his apology, though the trust between us would never be quite the same. The company itself had gone into receivership, just as Agent Torres had predicted. The court had appointed an interim management team to stabilize operations and eventually orchestrate a sale. I'd been approached about returning as a consultant during the transition, but I declined. It was time for a new chapter. I'd fielded the job offers carefully, looking for the right fit. Not just the right salary or title, but the right culture, the right leadership, the right values. I'd eventually accepted a position as Chief Compliance Officer at a large regional bank. It was a lateral move in some ways, but it was exactly the kind of role where my skills and my commitment to ethical operations would be valued. On my first day at the new job, my new boss had said, "We brought you in because we want someone who will tell us the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Someone who won't look the other way when something's wrong. That's you, right?" "That's me," I'd confirmed. "Good, because we've got some legacy issues that need addressing, and we need someone with the backbone to address them properly." It had felt like coming home. 6 months after Ashton's arrest, the trial had begun. He'd refused the plea deal, convinced he could talk his way out of the charges. His lawyers had built a defense around the idea that everything he'd done was standard business practice, that the prosecution was criminalizing aggressive but legal accounting methods. It hadn't worked. I'd testified for 2 full days. I'd walked the jury through every document, every email, every transaction. I'd explained in clear, accessible language how Ashton had systematically defrauded the company, how he'd hidden money in offshore accounts, how he'd manipulated financial records to deceive investors and lenders. The defense had tried to paint me as a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. "Isn't it true, Miss Winterbourne, that you were fired by Mr. Blackwell?" his lawyer had asked during cross-examination. "Yes." "And isn't it true that you were upset about being replaced by someone younger?" "No, that's not true. I was concerned about being replaced by someone who was committing fraud." "But you were upset about losing your position." "I was upset about watching someone damage a company I'd helped build and put good people's livelihoods at risk. The job itself was just a job. The principle was what mattered." "So you admit you had a grudge against Mr. Blackwell?" "I had a professional obligation to report illegal activity. Whether you call that a grudge or integrity is up to you." The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all 17 counts. Ashton had shown no emotion as the verdict was read, but his face had gone pale. At sentencing 2 months later, he'd received 12 years in federal prison and been ordered to pay restitution of over $18 million. The judge had been particularly pointed in her remarks. "Mr. Blackwell, you had every advantage in life. Education, resources, opportunities. You chose to use those advantages not to build something legitimate, but to deceive and defraud. You showed no remorse, no accountability, and no respect for the law. This sentence reflects the serious nature of your crimes and serves as a warning to others who might think that privilege exempts them from consequences." I'd been in the courtroom for the sentencing. As Ashton was led away, he'd looked at me one final time. The hatred was gone, replaced by something that might have been resignation, or perhaps understanding that he'd finally met someone he couldn't charm or intimidate or dismiss. I'd simply nodded. No gloating, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement that justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, reporters had swarmed. "Miss Winterbourne, how do you feel about the sentence?" "I feel that the legal system worked as it should. Mr. Blackwell received a fair trial and a sentence appropriate to his crimes." "Do you have any regrets about how this all played out?" "My only regret is that it had to happen at all. That someone chose personal enrichment over ethical business practices. That good employees had to go through months of uncertainty and stress. But I don't regret standing up for what was right." "What's your message to other professionals who might find themselves in similar situations?" I'd paused, considering the question carefully. "Document everything. Trust your instincts. If something seems wrong, it probably is. And understand that doing the right thing might cost you in the short term, but compromising your integrity will cost you far more in the long run. Your reputation, your self-respect, your ability to sleep at night, those things are worth protecting, even when it's difficult." The clip had gone viral, shared across professional networks and business schools. I'd become something of an unlikely icon for ethical leadership. I'd used that platform carefully, speaking at conferences about corporate governance, serving on nonprofit boards focused on business ethics, mentoring young professionals who were navigating complex workplace situations. But mostly, I'd just gone back to work. I'd continued doing what I'd always done, showing up, doing the job well, treating people with respect, and refusing to cut corners or look the other way when something wasn't right. A year after the trial, I'd been having coffee with one of my former team members from the old company, a young woman named Hannah who'd gone on to a promising career at a tech startup. "I still think about what you did," Hannah had said. "How you risked everything to stop Blackwell. I don't know if I would have had that kind of courage." "You would have," I'd replied. "When you're faced with a clear choice between right and wrong, you do what you were raised to do. You do what you can live with." "But you lost your job. You went through months of stress and investigation. You had to testify in court. That's a high price." "Would you rather I'd kept my job and let Blackwell destroy the company? Let him ruin people's careers and lives? Let him get away with fraud just because holding him accountable was inconvenient?" "No, of course not." "Then there wasn't really a choice, was there? There was only what needed to be done." Hannah had smiled. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple, not easy, but simple. Principles aren't complicated. Living by them, especially when there's a cost, that's the hard part." We'd finished our coffee and gone our separate ways, back to our respective careers, our respective lives. But I'd carried that conversation with me. It had reminded me why I'd done what I'd done and why it had been worth it. That evening, I'd been working late in my office at the bank, reviewing a complex compliance issue when my phone had rung. Unknown number. I'd almost not answered, but something had made me pick up. "Is this Calla Winterbourne?" A woman's voice, professional but warm. "Yes, this is she." "My name is Dr. Olivia Hammond. I'm the dean of the business school at Millbrook University. I'm calling because we're establishing a new ethics center, and we'd like to name it after someone who exemplifies ethical leadership in practice, not just in theory. Your name came up immediately. Would you be willing to discuss this with us?" I'd sat back in my chair, genuinely surprised. I'm honored, but why me?" "Because you didn't just talk about ethics, Miss Winterbourne. You lived them. You sacrificed for them. You showed an entire generation of business students that integrity isn't just a buzzword. It's a choice you make every day, especially on the days when it costs you something." We talked for another 30 minutes. Dr. Hammond had explained the vision for the center, research, teaching, professional development programs, all focused on building ethical leadership capacity in the business world. "We want your name on this because we want students to learn your story," Dr. Hammond had said. "We want them to understand that success isn't just about profit or advancement. It's about building something you can be proud of, something that creates value without destroying integrity." I'd agreed to think about it, but I already knew I'd say yes. Because if my experience could help even one person choose principle over profit, could help one person find the courage to speak up when something's wrong, then everything I'd been through would have been worth it. 2 years after the day Ashton Blackwell called me obsolete and had me escorted from the building, I stood at a podium in a university lecture hall, addressing an audience of business students, faculty, and professionals. People often ask me if I'd do it differently, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room. If I'd change anything about how I handled the situation with Ashton Blackwell, and the answer is no. Not because everything I did was perfect. I made mistakes along the way, but because I made those mistakes while trying to do the right thing and that I can live with. I'd paused, looking out at the faces watching me. Here's what I learned through that experience. Your career is important, but it's not more important than your integrity. Your job is important, but it's not more important than doing what's right. And success that comes at the cost of your principles isn't really success at all. It's just delayed failure. I'd click to the next slide, which showed a simple quote. Character is what you do when no one is watching. But I'd amend that slightly, I'd said. Character is what you do especially when people are watching, especially when there's a cost, especially when it would be easier to look away. That's when character counts the most. The students had given me a standing ovation. Afterward, several had lined up to ask questions, to share their own stories of ethical dilemmas in internships or entry-level jobs. To each one, I'd offered the same advice: document everything. Trust your instincts. Seek counsel from people you trust. And remember that your reputation is built over years but can be destroyed in moments. Protect it fiercely. As I'd driven home that evening, I'd reflected on the journey from that conference room where I'd been fired to this lecture hall where I'd been celebrated. It had been painful, uncertain, and at times terrifying. But it had also been right. And that made all the difference. Ashton Blackwell was serving his sentence in federal prison. The company had been sold to new owners who'd brought back many of the former employees and restored the ethical culture. The investors who'd been defrauded were receiving restitution. The legal system had worked. Not perfectly, not quickly, but eventually it had worked. And I'd played my part in making that happen. I don't think of myself as a hero. I was just someone who refused to be a bystander to wrongdoing. Someone who chose documentation over denial, action over acquiescence, principle over comfort. In the end, that's all any of us can do. Make the choice in front of us, as best we can, with as much integrity as we can muster. The rest is up to the universe. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Payback Office. If stories of workplace justice and professional integrity resonate with you, consider subscribing to our channel. We're working toward reaching 8,000 subscribers who believe that accountability and ethics still matter in the professional world. Until next time, remember, your principles are worth protecting, even when it costs you something, because they're the only things no one can take away unless you give them up.